time that traditional sort of economic development approaches are not sufficient alone, at least, to meet the needs of the state. I guess what we mean by traditional methods are basically to give tax breaks and try to find lower paid workers so that new businesses will want to start in the state and take advantage of these lower costs of operation. And we don't think this is a way to build a vibrant economy. Giving away too many tax breaks, first of all, deprives public institutions of revenue, and seeking low-wage jobs inevitably creates a workforce, if that would succeed, that is paid too little to become good, vibrant participants in the economy. So we don't think that we're calling traditional approach is sufficient to meet the needs of the number of distressed communities in the state. A second assumption that goes with that is, as the title of the presentation indicates, we're not just talking about cities, and Michigan has a number of them with severe problems with sort of symbolized with emergency managers and that sort of thing. But we have a lot of decline in rural Michigan. In our area, up in the middle of the state, up in Alma, we have a number of communities near us that once had public schools, once had, sort of a vibrant little downtown, maybe a block long or 2 blocks long or something like that, and are, close to being ghost towns or are in really sharp decline compared to what they were, a couple generations ago. So, this isn't only an urban issue, it's a statewide issue, we think. The only irony is that in the rural areas, the decline is largely brought on by something we often call the industrialization of agriculture, where instead of production of high value-added crops or products, we have moved to a model where you produce a huge amount at very low marginal profit, but enough in the large scale to make for a successful operation, but it leads to the depopulation of rural communities and loss of sort of a vibrancy there. So what are we suggesting as an alternative to what we have? Our proposal in a general way is that we would benefit if we began promoting on a wide-scale basis the development of cooperative enterprises. We're, glad to have other types of enterprises, but we just think that we need a new approach to overcome what we're calling this deficit in development in the state. And we especially think we need a strategy that not only relies on some outside investor, the classic sort of sugar daddy to move in and open an operation that employs a lot of local people. We want to show people in distressed communities that they can be their own entrepreneur. One of the students who's been heavily involved in this is a student of international business, and when she said she told a professor of hers, who's sort of a business type professor, that she was involved in this project, he said, well, that's socialism, isn't it? And, the one thing that has to be made clear to everyone, I guess, is that what we're talking about is promoting at the most basic level private entrepreneurship. We're not talking about government ownership of something. We're talking about developing a model that promotes cooperation on the part of people who are in a distressed community, who, as a result of, if this is successful, a successful implementation of this, would feel empowered, would feel, competent to launch some enterprise. Now, is there any way you can do this? Is this sort of pie in the sky dreaming, and there really isn't any way anywhere where you can do this? It's some sort of dream from Michigan, and it would never work because who could do this type of thing? Well, a number of years ago, we started to hear about, and some of you may know about, a place called Mondragon in Spain, in north-central Spain, and we started to hear that this may be a model for an alternative method of development. So the first step we got into a few years ago was trying to find out what Mondragon was and whether it was a model that could be replicated. So one of the first steps was a number of us went to Mondragon May a year ago and visited the community, got sort of an orientation to what happened there. The slide is showing a group of us at Mondragon University where they train people in the methods of cooperative development. So we did that. Okay, and we learned some things. I actually learned a lot about this community. First of all, it began this process of turning Mondragon into what many see as some sort of model of regional development. It began when the local pastor of the church in Mondragon, is for short, he has a very long last name, but they just call him Father Arizmendi. When Jose Maria Arizmendi decided the community, which was at the time very poor, they were coming out of the Spanish Civil War with a lot of social divisions. The young people in the community didn't have skills for any industrial activity. They were sort of poor rural people, and he realized they needed something to change this community. You know, people who are alive from that time point out the standard meal was beans. Many of the houses had didn't even have roofs and windows that had been destroyed in the Civil War. So this guy comes along and he says, we have to change our whole community, not just attract industry. That was part of it, was we need employment, but we need a cultural change. And by culture, he didn't mean to stop speaking the language or, you know, holding dear the old, what we often would call cultural practices. He didn't want to change those, but he wanted to change the attitude that you could not work together, that you were sort of stuck in this rural poverty, and especially change the young people. And he started small projects, give a little technical education, give some sports teams, this sort of thing, but fairly quickly decided he had to get these people into establishing economic activities, and this took off. So it's a long story between the 1940s and 2014, but this community seems to have succeeded. It succeeded enough that the one picture here, the thing that has Arizmendi written, is of a bakery chain in the San Francisco Bay Area that is named for him. He's become at least famous enough, most Americans wouldn't know of him, but at least famous enough that some people think he's a model for how you change a community. And Mondragon, at least, has really changed. Today, the collection of cooperatives around Mondragon have expanded to about 300 businesses with over 80,000 worker owners. The region where Mondragon is, which started as a rural, mountainous, poor region, sort of a, and not to insult our sister state, but sort of a West Virginia of Spain, now has the highest incomes and the lowest unemployment in the country, despite some problems with the fairly recent European and worldwide economic downturn, especially hard in Spain. The community has weathered that. There have been some difficulties, but they've come through it with much lower unemployment than the rest of Spain. So So, you know, this has sort of worked there. But it hasn't only worked there. A lot of people from around the world, not from the U.S. so much, but a lot of people from around the world have decided Mondragon may be a model. The university that we visited has sent staff to China, to Korea, to Mexico, and most recently in May, they reached an agreement with this Indian Center for Entrepreneurship to train people in India in the Mondragon model. Well, okay, we said all that. That's fascinating to visit and a fascinating place. But, you know, it's Spain, and it's operating now, sort of modeling what it has learned, Mondragon University, in other countries, but not the U.S. So one response might be, aren't co-ops foreign? Aren't, you know, like this professor who said something to my student, aren't they like socialism or some frightening thing like that? In fact, they aren't. Okay, and they aren't foreign to Michigan. Michigan was the first state in the U.S. to pass legislation to facilitate the development of cooperative enterprises. We did this as soon as the Civil War ended in 1865. In other ways, co-ops are a traditional part of U.S. economic activity. The picture here is of the Andrew Volstead house in Granite Falls, Minnesota, where I happen to have a daughter who lives there, and this is in town. And Volstead was the co-sponsor of the Agricultural Cooperative Act in 1922. And they memorialized this in town, and Minnesota has a lot of co-ops. So we have co-ops in the U.S. In fact, we have a lot of them. If you look at the map on this slide, the dots indicate co-ops. Okay, and I put on the left a few logos of co-ops that many of us probably patronize. We may even be members of the credit union, or if you're in rural America, rural electric co-op. There is a National Association of Co-ops founded in 1916, and it has thousands of co-op members. As far as the specific type of co-op that we give a lot of attention to in this co-learning plan, worker co-ops, and co-ops come in different structural forms, but worker co-ops, we have less of those in the U.S. than in a lot of other parts of the world where there are co-ops, but we do have them. And finally, in 2004, they formed an association of just the worker co-ops that is sort of a subpart of this national movement. And there is an international organization of worker co-ops headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland, and works very closely with the United Nations International Labor Organization. The U.S. co-ops are affiliated with an international movement of cooperatives, this ICA, founded in 1895. It's a very large organization with hundreds of associated federations of national cooperatives. If you really get interested in this presentation, it's not too late to sign up for the ICA's next big international meeting in Quebec City, October 6th to 9th. It looks to be a fascinating meeting. Anyone who would want to go would learn a great deal about co-ops, how to create them, what current co-ops are doing, that sort of thing. And this isn't just an organization Americans are affiliated with. Americans play a major role in the ICA. In fact, the head of the ICA right now, Chuck Gould, is an American with a law degree from University of Minnesota Law School, worked for a number of years in various organizations in the U.S. as an attorney, and more recently has moved over to be the Director General of the ICA. The ICA has a Washington office headed by a dynamic young woman, a graduate of Bryn Mawr College, and so there is this direct link to the U.S. There have been a couple other developments in the U.S. in the last generation or so, legal developments, that have created a number of businesses, a fairly large number in the first case, of businesses that are sort of a hybrid between the classic worker co-op and something else. In the 1970s, when we amended pension laws, the ERISA Act, created an option where companies could sell their shares to their employees and allow the employees to control the company. The logos here are some of the companies that are what we call ESOPs, Employee Stock Ownership Plan companies. Some of these, the ESOP is primarily controlled by a handful of the major managers at the firm. In other cases, there is fairly widespread ownership of the company by the worker stockholder owners. A newer development in the U.S. that's just been in the last 5 years has been the authorization in a number of states. I think it's right now at 13, with a number of states, including Michigan, considering whether to add this option to their corporate legislation, of something called the Community Benefit Corporation. One of the problems some people have with the obligations that traditional corporations have to their shareholders is that the board of directors of a firm and the management of the firm have to give priority almost solely to enhancing shareholder value, not also considering what might happen if workers lose jobs or if communities otherwise suffer. The Community Benefit Corporation structure would allow companies to, at the beginning, state that the purpose of the firm is to balance the interest of all of the local stakeholders. So there's all this background, and we increasingly thought this sounds like a possibility for applying the co-op idea to Michigan to address these problems of development. But we still had questions. We clearly weren't experts on cooperatives and wanted to learn more, and we approached the ICA because we heard they were the group with all the information on co-ops, and when we approached them, things sort of got out of hand. We got invited to go to their global research conference, which was held a couple weeks ago in Pula, Croatia. And we decided to take them up on this and went to Pula. We were asked to present on our plans, but most of the presenters were far more skilled than us. And the result of going there was we learned a great deal in detail about what our options might be and how we could respond to the needs of the community appropriately. On the way to Pula, we had to go through Italy, and because Italy is one of the centers of co-ops in at least Western Europe, has had some of the most successful co-op development, we decided to visit both some of the co-op organizations and also specifically some training programs there. Italy has over 1 million workers who are worker members of co-ops, over 43,000 businesses that are cooperative enterprises. The center of where we spent most of our time in Italy was in northeastern Italy in a region called Trentino, where cooperatives dominate many sectors of the economy. Over half, and in some cases well over half, of the enterprises in the region or co-ops. And they started over a century ago with a story much like Mondragon, except there hadn't been a civil war, but they started changing sort of the local culture and have turned Trentino from what was the poorest area of Italy in the late 19th century into one of, if not the richest areas of Western Europe. And there were many fascinating places we got to see where co-ops have made even small towns, which especially applies to us in places like Alma, small towns very vibrant and successful with small farming operations that produce a lot of value-added, high value-added products. Also in the capital of Trentino, Trento, is the University of Trento with something called the European Research Institute on Cooperative and Social Enterprises. We got invited to Trieste, and along with a group of Korean students who were also on their way to this conference in Croatia. The Korean students had an indirect link with us in that both of our groups have worked with people at Mondragon University, in fact with the same person primarily at the university, a guy named Juanjo Martin, and so we had an interesting discussion of shared efforts at applying the ideas we're learning about in our respective countries. The head of the program at Trieste, who led a lot of the training, made a comment towards the end that Koreans have had a reputation of following through on new economic ideas and making them very successful, and pointed out he thinks this current interest in developing cooperative enterprises in Korea may turn Korea into a model for such enterprises. Their concern, as I hope it would be here, is with young people who they think are being sort of bypassed by the current economy, and so they're trying to develop this approach to address the needs of especially youth in Korea. While we were in Italy, we also learned a lot about a region south of where Trent is, the Emilia-Romagna region. If you've heard of Bologna, that's in the center of this region. A region was devastated during World War II. The Germans sort of made their last stand in Italy there for over a year, and it was heavily bombed. And that area's leaders, as soon as World War II ended, decided that the only hope for getting quick development was to help the local artisan community develop co-ops. And much like the story of Mondragon and Trentino, this Emilia-Romagna region has now become one of the highest income regions of the country. So what are the lessons for us in all this? You know, we do think this can be applied to Michigan. It's always complicated to take some ideas from some other time or some other place and apply them, but we think we should be able to learn from this. The reason we especially think this is applicable is when you compare the conditions in a lot of distressed communities in Michigan with what Father Arizmendi faced or what Emilia-Romagna's leaders faced. The conditions here are no worse than they were there. They're about what they were there in some ways. Maybe we didn't have a war, but we often have economic problems, problems with youth unemployment, that sort of thing, that are just as severe as they face. You know, so they had high youth unemployment, youth without skills. They had communities with sharp social divisions. And there was no one in the community with a lot of money to invest and rescue the community with new enterprises. And still, they got people to join together, pool meager resources, They started programs to sort of change the youth culture, and they succeeded. So we think we can do that. And our proposal is that we should do that by making educational changes. Certainly there need to be some others, but we're sort of coming out of an educational perspective, and we think we should change education as one part of this effort at starting this approach to development. So in a general way, there are sort of three topics that need to be addressed. First of all, we have to help people in distressed communities understand what co-ops are and that they're a possible component in building a vibrant economy. We're not trying to replace successful businesses at all, but these are a way to move beyond the successful businesses that may be operating in a distressed community and build a lot of others that turn a distressed community from distressed into vibrant. We think there's evidence, whether it's Mondragon, Emilia-Romagna, Trentino, or all sorts of other places, and apparently Korea is trying this now, those who are working on this mass importation of co-ops to Korea. Cultural change is possible as far as sort of the work culture, the culture of collaboration. And we think that you can teach and people can learn cooperative entrepreneurship. Our proposal is to do this, or at least start this process, by adding not courses per se, and not creating a major in cooperative enterprise, but adding components, or offering components, which we're calling course modules, to Michigan institutions of higher education. Perhaps it could also be, some of these could be added at the K-12 level, but our focus has been on Michigan colleges, community colleges, and universities serving distressed communities. So we have come up with, initially we had 10 modules. After our visit to Pula and discussing what we were trying to do with people there, we merged some things, shifted some things into 8 modules. 3 of these are sort of components for courses on, collectively you might call them the social sciences and or humanities, and then some others are for courses, whether they were looking at, you wanted to call them economics itself or business, more specialized courses for those who move beyond the first 3 and decide, okay, I want to set up, attempt to set up a cooperative enterprise. So the first 3 are, first, teaching about the historical and cultural background of co-ops. Our thought is on this, we would primarily use the actual case studies that we've talked about now in this presentation. You know, our sort of thought is, why not? These are clearly working somewhere else. They're not all in one place, and there have been a number of studies of these, and there's plenty of material to help people get a brief understanding of the development of co-ops. We certainly include some U.S. information because, again, we have a lot of co-ops in the U.S., but we would focus here on just the historical and cultural background of co-ops. Getting into a little more detail about how these relate to sort of life, not just as, well, we have these enterprises. The development of co-ops especially relates to our sort of democratic beliefs in our country. You know, there aren't many Americans who aren't in favor of democracy as a concept, and co-ops really fit with a democratic society. There have been many observers who point out the oddity of the United States is culture is, despite our faith in democracy, for the core working part of the day, most Americans go off and work for a place that's not at all democratic. It's sort of monarchical or whatever, and you know, the boss tells you what to do and you do it, and it's assumed the best employee is the one who listens to the boss and does what the boss says and doesn't talk back. Building an appreciation of how democracy, participation, a sense of ownership is good, not just for the business even, but for the society, for the vibrancy of our democratic system, is an important component of this. And there's a lot of people who've written about this. There are a couple of people who focused on the study of Mondragon. There's some others, kind of Gus Speth, who for a long time headed the School of Forestry at Yale, who's now at Vermont Law School. You know, we need this sort of instruction, we think. Even someone, I don't know how many know of this, but a guy named W. Edwards Deming, a famed management expert, talked a lot about this, you know, all during the 20th century. This would be our second component, and then the third would be on the ability to change a culture. So it build on the other two. We've certainly had some work on this very close to home. Peter Wege, some of you may have heard of, who just recently died, who was the former chairman of the board of Steelcase, and developed a school program, the Center for Economicology. Peter Wege was very concerned about developing a sustainable, environmentally speaking, economy, and did a lot of work with people, including Gus Speth, who we brought in to speak a few years ago. Every year, Wege would hold a seminar in Grand Rapids and invite a lot of us there. I got to go a couple times, and he would bring in these people talking about how do you change a culture, and he worked on this until his death earlier this month. And this work, I'm sure, is going to continue. But changing a culture, we need to get people to understand, you know, we aren't stuck with this maybe dysfunctional local culture that prevents forming co-ops and getting people to be creative. So we do these basic components as our proposal. Again, modules to be inserted in some other courses and try to promote an understanding of how these initiatives have developed in the past. And then we need some training in some really basic skills. If people are going to try to launch a co-op, they need to understand the very basics of being concerned with financing and being concerned with the role of the employee who's now maybe the owner, or even if it's a more a consumer co-op, the employee has to have a different relationship to the customers. They aren't just coming in to buy something, they're invested in the organization. We have a number of U.S. case studies, the Arizmendi bakeries that we showed the picture of earlier. There's a co-op system down in Cleveland, Ohio, the Evergreen Cooperative. Clearly the Italian and Spanish cases we've referenced already and have visited provide information here for helping people understand what change has to take place in your attitude about the finances of one of these places. There's also the issue of law and regulation. We need people to have at least some rudimentary understanding of how law allows you to structure one of these cooperative enterprises. And there's a number of resources for this. Something called the Sustainable Economies Law Center out in California has a lot of material. The International Cooperative Alliance just in the past few months has come out with an international handbook of cooperative law that includes a section on the United States, even mentioning Michigan's pioneering role. So we would provide a component with a little basic overview of this, also especially giving some attention to these ESOPs and B corporation structures. ESOPs have especially been seen as a hopeful approach when you have an existing business that may be in financial difficulty and the owners are considering closing, and perhaps you can get the employees to transition that business into one owned by the employees by simply stock purchases. So we want to explain those on a basic level to people who might create one of these co-ops. The next is more focused on accounting. John Case, about a decade ago, came up with this concept of open book accounting, and so we think that is something people should learn something about, and just get the idea that to have a viable operation, you need people to be able to see the books of the company. We also need to expose people to the role they would have if they have a cooperative enterprise in either serving on or at least selecting the board who would run the operation if it grows relatively large, and their responsibilities to participate in assemblies of the worker owners. Then lastly, we want to try some method of inspiring, informing people who might be considering this approach to think of how they could create what we might call an idea-driven enterprise. How do you just become creative? There's a lot of literature on this. We have a lot of experience with this in places like Mondragon and other places with co-ops. We've been really impressed when we went to Mondragon University to see the operation they run, where they bring these kids in, basically freshmen, and they tell them by the time of graduation they have to have a functioning co-op they created. It's something both worries me but also seems to work. So we want to apply the lessons they have to trying to get people to see they can create enterprises. The conclusion of all this: we think we can do this, and we think if we train youth in the benefits of this, the Arizmendi approach to countering the culture's sort of dysfunctional features, we have a chance of success. If we can train youth in the specifics of what you need as far as how do you run such an operation, if we do that, we can see innovative new enterprises starting in impoverished Michigan urban and rural communities. So this is sort of a summary of what we're about. If you look on the website, it's a little hard to read, I guess, depending on the size of your monitor, but we have a selected bibliography of some sources. There are plenty of others. In the final conclusion, what I'd like to emphasize is we know we're not really experts on this. We welcome comments. I guess we even welcome criticisms. We welcome working together with others in trying to promote this approach to development. We think the current serious economic problems in urban and rural Michigan make it necessary, however, to try something like this. And since it has worked in communities with serious economic and social problems, we think it deserves a test here. In conclusion, again, we'd just like to thank the Department of Commerce for the grants that fund these co-learning plans, Michigan State and ALMA. I do want to mention the students, Will Donahue, Lauren Engels, Michelle Gerizano, Aaliyah McKessie, and Tracy Oberly, and also my wife, who've gone on the trips to Mondragon, to Italy, to Croatia with the students as chaperone, attended some of the key meetings, participated in those, and there's a variety of other people we could thank at this, at those Erixi, Legacorp in Rome, at Mondragon University, who have all helped us with this. Thanks, and thank you for listening to this.
Thank you, Dr. Lorenz. If any of the participants have questions or comments, please type them into the chat box. We'll keep checking to see. I'm sure there are lots of swirling thoughts and ideas. This is an interesting co-learning plan and the concept, and as Dr. Lorenz pointed out, this is not really new. It's just kind of discussing something that's maybe been on the outlying area of business. I guess they're considered more the outliers, but some of them have been very successful in doing this. And I was thinking, Dr. Lorenz, about a few co-ops or ESOPs that I'm familiar with, and I worked actually at the other REI, the Recreational Equipment Incorporated REI. They're in Northville and I think Ann Arbor, but they started out in the state of Washington, and they're a cooperative, and so they've been around for 40 or 50 years. So, and I didn't realize that Fat Tire Beer is an ESOP, or the flour company that you mentioned. I think I purchased that flour many times and didn't realize it. So they're probably in a lot of places, in a lot of grocery stores that we just have not noticed, but they're successful companies. And I think it's just the fact that we're having this conversation, and that there was a previous co-learning plan in our first year that also touched on this quite a bit. But I think that the uniqueness of what you're proposing is to teach it at the higher ed institutions, and we could become maybe a leader for the rest of the nation if we were able to get our universities or community colleges to really offer these types of modules on these 8 different areas. I think it's definitely worth a try, and to see if we can get business students interested in this as a different option. I have, if there aren't any other questions or comments in the box, I guess I'll just, I want to share that I was thinking to myself while you were talking, the history in itself is very interesting, but I'm wondering if our country is starting to transition since 2008, when we saw things collapsing around us and with Wall Street. And the mile law was just passed, the Michigan Invests Locally Exemption law. Crowdfunding has become huge, and sometimes it's crowdfunding for a good cause. This whole triple bottom line, EDA actually funded I think it was a university, and I can't remember who it was, but funded them to create a triple bottom line tool to see whether businesses in your community are considering the 3 Ps: people, planet, profit. But this type of business, like having a co-op or an ESOP, I think would cover those 3 Ps. You know, it's inevitable. And now we have the L3C categorization for corporations, and the socially responsible businesses like Cascade Engineering. And but I wonder your thoughts on, do you think that there's a lot more momentum, you know, hearing all these new, and even the shared economy, that's another one I just thought of. There's a real push for, you know, now we have zip cars and bike shares and Airbnb, and so do you think that there's a real drive that this is the best time to consider moving ahead with this at universities?
Yeah, I definitely do. I guess also, having come out of this conference a couple weeks ago, I was in awe of these. I mean, we had presentations on things like crowdfunding and this sort of thing, and there were a number of Americans there. They were talking about forming a new group for young American scholars who want to look at development of co-op sort of tools and methods of education. You know, I think anyone who seems to find this interesting, I think this Quebec conference is going to be a fascinating, you know, exposure to this. It's not too far away, and a number of American institutions, you know, the co-op, the Credit Union Association, the Rural Electric Co-op Organization are all important sponsors of that, and so there are a lot of there's a lot of momentum, I think, building to this. You know, I think if I sort of could channel you know, Father Arizmendi, I think what he would have said was, you know, you had to have this crisis to have the opportunity to develop this. It isn't good to have an economic crisis, but on the other hand, it can make us creative. I guess it can make us depressed.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, in the case of Mondragon, it was the crisis, you know, that they had gone through that clearly stimulated the desire to, we just have to do something. You know, we can't just sit here and wait for someone to come in and save us with, you know, a super new factory or a, you know, a new investment.
It seems
so I think
we are kind of waiting for the big company to get bigger.
Yeah, because it seems like it's not going to happen. And, you know, the one thing that, of course, one term that gets used with a lot of these options, and all the ones, whether it's ESOPs or, you know, worker co-ops or whatever it is, these tend to be place-based, or at least they're based in wherever the corporation is currently operating, even if it's not one place, you know. And that alone means, you know, one thing a lot of us in Michigan have seen is the movement of operations out of state. You know, unless everyone at the, you know, the company that's a worker co-op decides they want to live in Korea or Mexico, the business isn't going to move because the owners work here. You know,
and very good point. Yeah. Well, if there's this much momentum and the time seems right, then what would a university or college have to do in order to get a hold of your modules? I mean, I know you have your co-learning plan, but how would they, do you have some recommendations on how they would do this? I mean,
right.
Should they tour like you did, or can they simply just get as much as they can from the co-learning plan? I'm sure you have sources here in your bibliography, but are there YouTube videos that they can watch? Something that would build the case a little bit more, maybe for a professor or somebody, you know, a faculty that are considering teaching this.
What we're trying to have with the co-learning plan is, and I guess we have a month before it's absolutely presented, but you know, it's pretty much final. We're trying to come up with suggested resources, you know, readings, you know, various, like the John Case book on open book management, this sort of thing, and guide people through, you know, we think this is a minimum should be included if you do one of these modules. So if you, for example, just because I just mentioned him, if you were teaching, I guess, accounting, do you insert a segment where you talk about his idea of how you should do, and it actually gets beyond just accounting into general management, but do you teach about that approach, you know? And our hope initially was that we will have enough of these that are clear enough that someone could insert them for, you know, 2 weeks in what is otherwise a class on a related topic.
Oh, okay, I see. Yeah, so it would be a lesson plan of sorts.
Yeah, for a short part. I mean, you know, in some ways we'd love to have this become a whole, you know, class. You know, and essentially Mondragon University offers a major in this. That's sort of what you do if you go there. But, you know, we're not anticipating we're going to change things that much initially. What we're hoping, because even if we did succeed in that way, most people wouldn't probably take that component. They would decide, well, I want to do something else. Whereas if these could become modules in basic courses in sociology, economics, history, whatever, then a lot of people would be exposed to the idea. And, you know, some may say, I don't like this, I don't want to become the creator of a new co-op in my community, but the goal would be we'd find a lot of people who say, I never thought I could do this. You know, I'm now that I see this has been done successfully in, you know, Minnesota or Spain or whatever, I'm going to try to do that. Mm-hmm. You know, and I'm going to try to start some new operation. I had this idea, you know, essentially what they do apparently at Mondragon University is they have a lot of like time to sort of dream. What do you wish you had? What do you wish existed? What do you wish happened? And out of this, sometime come ideas that are really marketable products.
And they're conducive to the co-op model. They would work for that.
Yeah, because you don't need, if you can really make this happen, if you really do it, and these other places have done it, you literally just get some people together. In the cases of a lot of the ones we've looked at, these are basically people without many resources, and they pull scant resources and start this, and with luck, some fail, no doubt. It isn't a magic guarantee that everything will succeed, but some of these work.
Right, and that's business in general. It's a high risk to start a business, and they often fail in less than 5 years, I guess, is the statistic. But I think that in the long run, a co-op may have more resiliency and be more sustainable, is what you're arguing, that would make more sense to be, in some ways, less risky.
There are a number of studies now, especially after the recent financial crisis of 2008-9, and especially because it hit Europe very hard, and there are a lot of co-ops in Europe. There have been a number of studies of the focus on how they have done, clearly it seems from what I've seen. Clearly, the data indicates the co-ops did better than regular businesses. The sort of the traditional business with the shareholders and, responsibility primarily to the outside investors. That co-ops, the Mondragon co-ops, I mean, they did votes on cutting wages 20%, cutting back hours, this sort of thing. Because they knew their financing, and they, in most cases, were able to pull through. There have been some that failed, but they have had a better rate of getting through this crisis than have what you might call traditional businesses.
Yeah. Well, I don't see any other comments or questions in the box, but oftentimes I think that once these webinars are archived on our website, and then later, oftentimes we see visits from various people all over, and you could have as many as 100-some clicks on your webinar, people that will be watching it. So you may have some follow-up from this webinar. People may send you emails or call you and want to talk more about it. But thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful, and it has so much to offer. As far as the co-learning plan to lots of audiences. You will be presenting at the Innovate Michigan Summit, and I don't recall what time, but I know that you'll be there, and I'm hoping that you'll have a huge turnout at your presentation. I would like to give a plug for our next webinar that's coming up next Wednesday, July 23rd. It'll start at 10 in the morning. Operation Above Ground, Improving Licensing for New Food Businesses to Promote a Stronger Detroit Food Economy. And our presenters will be Rebecca Baylor, Davita Davidson, Jess Daniel, and the Operation Above Ground team at Food Lab Detroit. And they're going to summarize their research on their co-learning plan, and they'll discuss their allies that they have formed to understand and map the licensing process for shared use kitchens and other alternative models of food business. They're hoping to take the first step in removing a significant barrier to the emergence of a more diverse, thriving, healthy, and innovative food economy, specifically in Detroit. So I encourage everyone participating today in this webinar to join us on July 23rd at 10 o'clock in the morning for Jess Daniels and her team. Thank you again, Dr. Lorenz, and we will have this webinar up on the REI website soon, so I encourage you to share the link with other colleagues and come and see Dr. Lorenz and talk to him at the summit on September 4th.
Thanks, Jen.
At the Kellogg
Thank you
Center.
for this.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.